Hello and good morning. Okay, so in today's live, I'm going to be talking about a really interesting topic. I think I'm not just saying it's interesting because I think it's interesting. I'm saying it's interesting because this is something that I know is an issue for many people for whom an important part of their identity is being Christian, being Catholic, being a disciple of Christ. So they are very, or I'll say we are very sincere in wanting to follow Christ. You know, we are relatively well-formed, maybe spiritually in terms of intellectually formed about our faith. And then when we hear about, all this talk about self-care, or self-love, sometimes these two are used interchangeably, like self-care and self-love. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. Sometimes there's a distinction made between them, and I would say it's not always a good thing that the distinction is made between them. It can be helpful and unhelpful. I'll get to that in a minute. But I just want to talk about this because in many Catholic conversations, I see terms like, excessive individualism, like all these overemphasis on the individual, basically. So talk about self-care is often linked with just a secular perspective of self-care, which by secular they would usually mean non-spiritual, non-religious. And it's almost like it's implied not for the spiritually mature kind of thing. Hey, welcome to anyone who drops in on this live. So yes, I'm talking about self-care and whether or not whether we perceive self-care as something to be only for the morally and maybe spiritually weak. Okay, so we may not think about this explicitly, right? We may not say it, but I think many serious Christians or serious Catholics who take their faith seriously, who always think about, carrying the cross and the importance of self-sacrifice and all that, we instinctively think of taking care of ourselves as, I can't help it, I have to because I'm limited. It is a concession to my weakness, right? And maybe there's an implicit assumption or a thought that when I am morally superior, like maybe morally more mature or spiritually more mature, that I don't need as much care of self. Just pause a minute if you're watching this and, whether it's on replay or live, pause a minute and just think about whether or not that's true. Whether or not when you decide to maybe take a nap or, take a break from work, sleep in a little bit more, whatever it is, or indulge in a bit of food, whether you always think of it as this is a concession to weakness. Now, it's understandable why we have this presupposition, right? This is one of the issues, I think, when we have a more dualistic or binary understanding of good. It's like everything is either good or evil. It's 1 or 0. There is no gradation. There is no concept or appreciation of appropriateness for different seasons. So for example, it's appropriate when, if when you're not well, or when you're younger, for example, to maybe nap a lot during the day. Maybe not so appropriate if you are at work, right? I mean, you're in the office. But having the ability to look at different contexts and different situations helps us to get out of just that binary black and white kind of understanding of, is this something that's good or bad? Is, for example, self-care something only for the morally and spiritually weak? They have no choice, but they need to get self-care. And therefore, maybe saints or those who are really mature don't need that. So I'm thinking about self-care because apparently 24th July, which is just a couple of days ago, was International Self-Care Day this year. And I was musing about that because it's true. It's true that in the secular world, self-care is itself is a booming industry also, right? All this wellness and care and self-care. So it's easy for those who are spiritually minded or who take our faith seriously. It's easy for us to want to dismiss anything related to self-care as just not spiritual. And I want to put a pause on that kind of thinking. I want to call it out, right? Because we, at least on this channel, on this account, on this podcast, we're always interested in integration and embodiment. We're always careful about, leaning just on one side too hard and at exclusion of everything else. So one way that I have sometimes heard in an attempt to distinguish between secular self-care or maybe kind of like indulgent self-care. Let's call it indulgent self-care, okay? And what people make this distinction will want to say is self-love. So people, sometimes when you hear this distinction, self-care versus self-love, it's with that attitude that self-love is the superior one, like better, and self-care is kind of like the more frivolous one, okay? So for example of self-care in this kind of framework might be, bubble baths and massages and chocolates and, junk food, comfort eating, maybe taking naps, just kind of like you get a sense of, it's like indulging the senses for relief and release, right? Self-care, sometimes we just think about all that, And self-love is linked to something that requires a bit more discipline. So for example, eating more healthily, having a healthy diet, lifestyle, regular exercise, maybe spiritual practices, meditation, exercising virtue, for example. Now, in a broader definition of self-care, all these also come under self-care, but sometimes I think people try to say, there's healthy self-care and it's the one that I just mentioned that's kind of like, that requires some discipline and longer term care for the self. And then there's unhealthy self-care or the more frivolous, indulgent, secular kind of self-care, which is just indulging the senses and pleasure. And it's a bit more like emphasis on license and freedom, or freedom in the sense of license, right? And we tend to think of that as not helpful spiritually or not helpful for us as spiritual beings on the road towards wholeness and authenticity. So I just want to say that from the perspective of interior integration and of wanting to grow in wholeness and authenticity, making such a sharp distinction between what we think is acceptable or not so acceptable self-care or indulgent versus healthy self-care, or thinking that all forms of indulgence is therefore unspiritual and unhealthy, that is unhelpful. Okay, so I'll repeat that. Trying to distinguish between what we think is just superficial, indulgent, frivolous kind of self-care, right? Like bubble bath and treats and massages, for example, versus healthier self-love that requires exercise, discipline, healthy lifestyle, all that. Making too sharp a distinction is unhelpful. I'm not saying that it's not good to make such a distinction, but distinctions, I'm all about distinctions, okay? I'm trained in philosophy, and it's not just as an intellectual exercise. I actually believe that having clear understanding of what, clear framing and clear understanding of what our assumptions are can really help us in an interior journey. But there is a difference between just sorting things out conceptually and what helps us to make the journey. And when we talk about the interior journey, we're always emphasizing what helps us to actually grow towards authenticity, wholeness, greater capacity to love God, love self, love neighbor. Okay, so anything that is unhelpful for us to make this journey from the perspective of integration, we need to park it. Okay, the same thing can be helpful when we are at a certain stage or season in the journey and not helpful at another stage. So we need to know that distinction. Why do I say that making such distinctions or thinking of self-care or maybe the more frivolous or secular kind of self-care as unspiritual and for the morally and spiritually weaker, why is that unhelpful? Because one, It it increases our shame, our sense of shame for needing anything to do with care for self. Okay, we are human beings who we're not robots. We're not operating in a laboratory with controlled variables. Okay, you and I, we're flesh and blood, flesh and bone. We are wounded people on the journey towards greater wholeness, right? On the journey to knowing we are loved, not just in our mind, but in our bodies. Given our lived experiences and our life experiences, and for many of us, the complex trauma that we would already have experienced in our life up to this point, we already have a lot of shame and guilt about not being good enough. We have a lot of issues about, that we're not worthy of God's love. These are obstacles to the journey of becoming more integrated. These are obstacles to becoming more capable of actually being mature disciples that can love God and love neighbors selflessly, like genuinely, freely, selflessly. Okay, there's no argument that that's the goal or that's the hope that we move towards that kind of maturity, embodied spiritual and emotional maturity, right? That enables us to really witness Christ in our life. There's no debate about that. The issue is, given where we are, increasing our sense of shame and guilt is not only not going to help us get to that goal any faster, it's going to keep us stuck. Think about it. When we are so filled with shame and guilt for needing care, then there is that added chance that there's a swing of the pendulum, right? I mean, for every, I think it's in physics, there's a law of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. When we suppress our needs, our legitimate needs for too long, eventually it's going to bounce back. I've heard this described, okay, by Dr. Gabor Mate. He uses this imagery, which I think is very helpful. He says, imagine you're in a swimming pool. So the water is very buoyant, right, in a swimming pool. And you have a big ball, like a big red ball, and it kind of floats on the water, right? Because it's less dense. And if you're going to try and push and force that ball to be submerged under the water, right? If you're going to try and push the ball that's actually floating on the water, submerged under water, as long as you're holding on to it or you put your whole body weight on it, the ball can remain submerged. But the moment you let go, what's going to happen to that ball? It's going to bounce right back up, right? Because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when we keep suppressing what are legitimate natural needs, because we are creatures, we are finite, it's not a concession to weakness. It is just taking good care of ourselves and of one another. If we don't know what, as creatures, what we need to thrive, how can we see one another as people worthy of love? Right? So I'm going to take a moment here and also make another kind of distinction that hopefully will be helpful. We have all this concern, okay, those of us who want to be disciples, who are disciples, we have this concern about excessive individualism, right? I see this term a lot also in forums, in Christian or Catholic forums, right? And it is an issue. But like I said earlier, excessive individualism can be depicted as that ball I mentioned earlier that has been submerged for too long under the water. You force it down, and when you let go and that ball kind of like shoots up into the air, excessive individualism is kind of like, it's the reaction, right? It's the reaction to something that had happened first. So if excessive individualism is not what we want, if it's something that we see as problematic, instead of just saying that it's problematic or judging that it's problematic, we need to get curious, compassionate, and courageous about why is there excessive individualism. Okay, so that's a question, first and foremost, for ourselves. When we find that we are leaning towards excessive indulgence, we are leaning, or we need, a lot of self-soothing. I'm not judging that, because I think first and foremost, what is not helpful, practically speaking, on the interior journey is when we constantly evaluate and judge our own actions. Then we're not safe space for ourselves, and then we can't be honest with ourselves, okay? Christ always holds us with so much compassion that there is room for us to be safe in that compassion, to begin to look and wonder at the reality that we are in. Why is it that I am acting this way? Right? So clearly, what I'm talking about, I'm not denying the fact or truth of sin or good or evil, but I'm saying when we want to move towards the fullness of good, we need to be able to suspend judgment sometimes and to recognize that on a journey, there's space that's needed, there's time that's needed. Things don't just happen in an instant. And especially when we're dealing with creatures like ourselves, right? We ourselves are creatures who have been wounded. We need a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding to meet ourselves where we are at, and then to be able to recognize that even the tendency towards what we may think is a little overindulgent, maybe too superficial, I can't just have bubble baths and massages the whole time, right? I mean, no one can or should. But what is that saying to me about some legitimate need, perhaps, that I have been depriving myself of? So here's the thing. Usually, when we need a lot of just self-soothing, like comfort eating, or like I mentioned, all these kind of like treats, and we're sleeping a lot. From the psychological or neuroscience perspective, those are usually signs that our nervous system is very stressed, that we are probably in a freeze mode, okay? We are numbing ourselves, or we are fleeing, fight or flight, right? Fight, flight, freeze. There's something that's making us unsafe, and we are reacting to it. And if we don't go to the root of the matter, to care for ourselves, to really, in this case now, really love ourselves in a deeper way, and not just through discipline in terms of like, I need to exercise more, or I need to pray more. No. I mean, all that has its place, but that's besides the point. That's the point that, most of us who are already aware that exercise is good, that, prayer is good, what we cannot see is that holistic care and spirituality is much more than that. So here's where I think we need to understand the difference between just like individualism, that the way we think about it, like overly individualistic, and personalism. Okay, personalism. Okay, this is going a little bit philosophical. But personalism is a stance, it's a philosophical stance, that can be very broad. Let's not get too academic about it. But a very well-known Christian Catholic person, that who has a stance of personalism will be Saint Pope John Paul II. Personalism takes a stance that the human person has to be at the center of has to be at the center of, I guess you could say, even the theology. Okay, I mean, not the human person absolutely in the center, because God loves the human person, right? So everything else in the created world, in that sense, cannot violate however we operate in the world, should not violate the dignity and the dignity, the nobility of a human person. Now, personalism is also about the uniqueness and the individuality of each person. It states, or it's saying that you and I, we're not just a number, we're not just a digit, we're not just part of a congregation or a flock, right? Like the Good Shepherd, Christ the Good Shepherd, knows every single one of his sheep by name. He doesn't see us as just one group. Every one of us is precious, and he has counted, he knows every hair on our head. God knows every hair on our head. That's how specific, how unique, how individually he loves each of us, right? Personalism is saying this is how we should be acting too in our interactions with one another, whether it's at work, in our economy, in culture, in our churches, which is why John Paul II said that the only appropriate response to another person, to a human person, is love. A subject to be loved in an end in him or herself, never meant to be used as an object for some other end. Personalism says that, well, we're precious. You and I are precious. So what has personalism got to do with individualism? Could it be, I'm just putting this out as a question, okay, for us to consider, because it's important for us to get curious and to ponder about our struggles, right? Our struggles with sin, our struggles with, let's say, feeling the need to protect ourselves and compete. Could that be, whatever signs of excessive individualism we might have, could that be a reaction to our person already being violated, our personhood not being given the reverence and the honor and the love that God meant for us to have? Could another person, maybe your spouse, maybe your child, maybe your friend, maybe someone that you're leading, mentoring, pastoring, whatever, could their excessive individualism, or what you perceive as their excessive individualism, be a reaction to them being used, not seen, not heard, not attuned to since their childhood? Could they have only known a life of emotional survival where if you didn't fight and compete and take, you wouldn't get anything, right? And if such a person is not given love, honor, reverence, how is he or she going to heal from that trauma? Because what has happened is the dignity of the human person has not been upheld in many ways that may be invisible to our eyes. And if that's the case, then the reaction of being in fight or flight or freeze is a natural response. It's a natural response, right? If we need to put a label on it, okay, so I'm putting on the other hand and say, oh, precisely, so these people, when we are in that state, we're still morally and spiritually weak. Okay. But I'm going to ask again, from the perspective of interior integration, is it at all helpful for you to accompany yourself, or for you to accompany someone else who is struggling, to tell them or to label them or label yourself as being morally or spiritually weak? I think it's really useless and unhelpful, okay? Especially because it denies another very important truth, which is everything that is given and created is good and given to bless and uphold us and help us, to strengthen us. Nothing in and of themselves, however, what in and of themselves is good or evil. It's their use, right? The way that they're used, and the way that whether they are used to uphold human dignity, uphold and increase human dignity, our sense of how loved we are, or is it used to diminish us? Is it used to just continue to numb us? So you see, it's not so much the activity or the thing itself, right? Even like bubble baths or massages, it's not so much the activity or the thing itself. You can't say whether this is good or bad. Is it helpful or not helpful for us to grow in integration and maturity? It all depends. It depends on how we're using these things, because things are meant to be used, right? If it increases our sense of dignity, if it reminds us that we are worthy of care because we have neglected our own care for too long, if it is a way to show another person that they are remembered, that they are loved for him or herself and not for what they can do, not for any value that they can bring, and to give them a little extravagance and indulgence, or to give ourselves a little extravagance and indulgence, is a way to remind us and remind them that our value is more than our doing, then I think it can be a very spiritual thing. That self-care, even what we tend to think of as the secular, frivolous self-care, can be a very holy thing. And on the flip side, and it might make some of us cringe when we think about that, what we usually think of as activities that are very prayerful and spiritual, maybe saying the rosary, going to adoration room, holy hour, those acts, as good as they may be, if we are using those acts to run away from the actual work that we need to do because we think, well, I've prayed. I pray every day. I've done my devotion every day. I'm okay with God, and we don't actually let God in to show us what is it that actually needs transformation, then that prayer, that discipline, that spiritual discipline in and of itself, it may not be that helpful and maybe less holy than we think it is. Right? I think we need to take a step back to see how everything can be seen in different light when we understand the deepest goal, the most important goal, is union with God and union with Christ. And that depending on the season we're in, the stage that we are in, the specific work, because it's a journey, it's a long journey with many stages, with many seasons, and at different seasons and different stages, the nature of the work can be very different. What is appropriate for the season that we are in to bring us that one step closer into authenticity, one step deeper into our relationship with Christ, to feel more securely loved by God, that is what would be helpful for us. And labeling anything, including, I think, something that's often missing, labeling something like caring for ourselves as selfish, or as thinking of it as something that's for a concession for our own weakness, well, it increases our shame, or increases the shame in other people, and actually may set us back. So I invite you to really consider, what relationship do you have with self-care and self-love? Okay, do these words still make you cringe, or do you still feel something when you kind of get a sense that other people are judging you because you're practicing self-care in a way, and you think that, maybe your family or your community or other people are thinking, yeah, that's like not Christ-like at all. That's not discipleship. Yeah. If that's how you feel, and that may be a reality that you're in, here's a suggestion and here's an invitation. The truth is, this entire interior journey is one that can only be made with grace, right? We are not about being a stoic and using our brute will and strength to show how good we are, how virtuous we are, how moral we are. That's not Christian discipleship at all. Christian discipleship is predicated first and foremost on an acknowledgement of our weakness and on an acknowledgement of our utter and complete dependence on God's love for us first, and that every step towards Him can only occur with grace. So, it is a very beautiful thing to pray for, to be able to be exactly where we are and not more ahead or advanced in the journey than we think we should be, than other people maybe think we ought to be, and to be able to be at peace even in being judged by others. Because, it's a wonderful thing to say, I am where I am, and God loves me exactly here where I am. And in His love, and in His time, and in His grace, I hope to go beyond where I am. But I'm not in a rush or a hurry, because I'm not trying to prove how good I am to Him or to anyone else, even to myself, right? I am here to be loved and to learn to return that love, to grow in my capacity to hold myself in awe and wonder and reverence, even as the flawed and sinful, broken creature that I am. And in doing so, I grow in my capacity to behold another person with wonder and reverence and awe, even in their brokenness and sinfulness. And I learn to encounter the frustration and all the difficult emotions that I may have, and anger, whatever struggles I may have. I learn to encounter all of that, and hold it loosely. And I can make room for it. I find that I have space for it. The interior journey, the way that we are talking about it, at least, is one that goes beyond the natural good. Yes. But that doesn't mean that the natural good is not beautiful. I think we cannot skip steps. And we cannot just want what is supernatural and not be grateful for what is natural, including our body and our nervous system. And we must remember that to be able to transcend all this, to transcend the natural good, the natural state, the natural needs that we have, really requires supernatural grace. So let's not run ahead of that grace. And let's not burden ourselves so much and burden other people so much with all these labels that sort us out into weak and strong and spiritual or unspiritual, I mean, there's a place and time for that. But when we want to make this journey, if you find that it's holding you back, then give it up. Give it up for this season or this stage. And remember, I think it was Pope Francis maybe who said it. I'm sure plenty of other people who have said it. When we're judging someone, we can't love them. It's the muscles just don't work that way. So maybe we need to withhold and refrain from constantly assessing, evaluating, and judging ourselves, and become a contemplative and just behold who we are and how loved we are, and allow ourselves to love and care, receive love and care, including from ourselves, without shame. So that's a thought I leave with you this midweek. And I hope that it's given you something new to think about. I hope that it improves your relationship with yourself and your relationship maybe with self-care and self-love. Maybe have less of an ambivalent, guilt-ridden kind of relationship with that. And if you have any questions or comments about this, please drop me a DM. I'm happy to address that, respond to that and address that maybe in a future life, because these are all important themes and topics of the interior journey that is kind of like in the subconscious, and we don't realize how much they trip us up until we bring them out, make them explicit, and talk about it. So blessings for the day. Until the next live. See you. Bye.